Number 1. Joyce Vincent was a 38-year-old British woman whose death went unnoticed for more than 2 years as her corpse lay undiscovered in her North London bedsit. Prior to her death, Joyce had cut off almost all contact with those she knew. She quit her job in 2001 and moved into a shelter for victims of domestic abuse. Around the same time, she began to reduce contact with friends and family. She died in her bedsit around December 2003 with neither family, co-workers, nor neighbors taking notice. Her remains were discovered on January 25, 2006, with the cause of death believed to be either an asthma attack or complications from a recent peptic ulcer. Her remains were described as mostly skeletal according to the pathologist, and she was lying on her back, next to a shopping bag, surrounded by Christmas presents she had wrapped but never delivered. It is not known to whom the presents were addressed. Neighbors had assumed the flat was unoccupied, and the odor of decomposing body tissue was attributed to nearby waste bins. The windows did not allow direct sight into her room, and it was a noisy building, which may explain why no one questioned the constant noise from the television, which remained turned on until she was discovered. Half of her rent was being automatically paid to Metropolitan Housing Trust by benefits agencies, leading officials to believe that she was still alive. However, over 2 years, $2,400 in unpaid rent accrued, and housing officials decided to repossess the property. Her corpse was discovered in January 2006 when bailiffs had forced entry into the flat. The television and heating were still running due to her bills being continually paid for by automatic debit payments and debt forgiveness. The Metropolitan Housing Trust said that due to housing benefits covering the costs of rent for some period after Joyce's death, arrears had not been realized until much later. The trust also said that no concerns were raised by neighbors or visitors at any time during the 2 years between her death and the discovery of the body. Joyce's remains were too badly decomposed to conduct a full post-mortem autopsy, and she had to be identified from dental records. Police ruled her death by natural causes as there was nothing to suggest foul play. The front door was double-locked and there was no sign of a break-in. At the time of her death, she had a boyfriend, but the police were unable to trace him. Her sisters had hired a private detective to look for her and contacted the Salvation Army, but these attempts proved unsuccessful. The detective found the house where Vincent was living, and the family wrote letters to her. But as she was already dead by this time, they received no response, and the family assumed that she had deliberately broken ties with them. Her friends noted her as someone who fled at signs of trouble, who walked out of jobs if she clashed with a colleague, and who moved from one flat to the next all over London. She didn't answer the phone to her sister and didn't appear to have her own circle of friends, instead relying on the company of relative strangers who came with a package of a new boyfriend, a colleague, or flatmate. Number 2. 31-year-old Michael Taylor from Usset, West Yorkshire, England, brutally murdered his wife, Christine. He attacked her with his bare hands, tearing her eyes and tongue out and almost tearing her face off, then strangling their poodle. He was found by a policeman, naked in the street, covered with blood. Prior to the murder, Christine stated to a Christian fellowship group to which they belonged to, that his relationship with the leader of the group, Marie Robinson, seemed sexual in nature. Michael is reported to have felt an evil influence cast a shadow over him, and then compelled by this force, vented a sudden fury on surprisingly not Christine, but Marie Robinson. He lashed out at her, verbally and physically, to the point that several other churchgoers in the congregation had to physically restrain him, fearing that he would seriously hurt himself or someone else. Marie Robinson herself later testified as to what happened when Michael attacked her. She said, "I suddenly glanced at Mike and his whole features changed. He looked almost bestial. He kept looking at me and there was a really wild look in his eyes. I started screaming at him out of fear. I started speaking in tongues. Mike also screamed at me in tongues. I was on the verge of death and I seemed to come to my senses. I knew that only the name of Jesus would save me, and I just started saying over and over again, Jesus. When Christine heard me calling on the name of Jesus, she started saying it too, and I believe firmly that it was only by calling on his name that I was not killed." Michael would claim later to have had no memory of this incident. Despite this frightening violent outburst, the following day Michael was to receive full forgiveness and a church absolution from Robinson for what had happened. But none of the rest of the congregation could forget the outburst, and Michael was closely watched following this episode. It soon became apparent that his deteriorating, out-of-character behavior seemed to now be permanent, and was in fact getting worse as time went on, with his sanity clearly slipping. The seriousness and frightening condition that Michael was in was so severe that several local ministers became involved, and came to the realization that Michael might be under the influence of demonic forces. Finally, the local vicar came to the controversial conclusion that an exorcism should be performed on Michael. As soon as the exorcism had started, Michael went into uncontrollable convulsions and fits, and bouts of scratching, spitting, and biting, requiring him to be forcefully tied to the floor. Over the next 8 hours, Michael was subjected to all sorts of indignities, such as having crucifixes shoved into his mouth and being doused with holy water. All throughout, Michael was growling and snapping at anyone who came near him. The priests in charge of the exorcism claimed that the ceremony had managed to ascertain that there were about 40 demons inhabiting Michael's body, representing such traits as incest, bestiality, blasphemy, lewdness, heresy, masochism, and carnal knowledge. As one can imagine, these alleged demons did not go easily from Michael, each one having to be reportedly dragged out kicking and screaming. After 8 hours, by 8 a.m. on October 6, 1974, the priests carrying out the exorcism could no longer continue through exhaustion. It was decided that the exorcism would have to be finished at a later time, although the priests claimed that 3 demons, those of insanity, anger, and murder, were still stubbornly possessing Michael and had not been successfully removed yet. Apparently, the congregation who had been present for the exorcism agreed in part, for one witness to the terrifying events, a minister's wife named Margaret Smith, was to claim later that she had received a warning in her mind from what she believed to be God, saying that the demon of murder was going to escape from Michael and kill Christine. She pleaded with the 2 priests to complete the exorcism, but they dismissed her warnings and instead told Michael and Christine to go home to rest and prepare for the next and final part of the exorcism, which was to be performed the following day. Now, whether there were really demons still infesting Michael Taylor's body or not, or whether he had succumbed to a full-on psychosis and had been tipped over the edge by the events of that night, what would follow that day was nothing short of pure evil and insanity. It was about 9:45 the next morning, October 7th, and not 2 hours after Michael and Christine had been sent home to rest up to prepare for the next part of the exorcism. A police patrol car passing through the normally quiet streets of Ossett came upon a shocking and unnerving sight. Coming around a corner, the officer in the car, Ian Walker, was confronted by the sight of a man stumbling around in the middle of the street, naked and covered head to toe in blood. His body was slicked with it. The officer stopped the car and approached the man. As he got closer, the man curled into the fetal position and began screaming over and over, "It is the blood of Satan." Unsurprisingly, this had attracted a crowd of onlookers, some of which knew the disturbed man. The police officers who had approached the man immediately called for an ambulance, fearing that Michael had hurt himself or someone else, and tried his best to talk to and calm Michael, who was still screaming and senseless, ranting only about Satan. He continued screaming as the ambulance from the local hospital arrived, and he was placed into it and taken away. The crowd of onlookers who had crowded around the ambulance now told the police that the deranged maniac was Michael Taylor, and gave the officer his address, to which the patrol car then went to. Upon arrival at the Taylor house, a police car was there already, that had been summoned for by frightened neighbors who had heard yelling and screaming. The officer approached the house but was stopped by the sight of his inspector emerging from the front door, bending over and vomiting. Feeling that he had to go in, the officer stepped into the Taylor house. He claimed that the interior of the front room was destroyed, with signs of destruction. Blood covered every surface of the room, along with the flesh, pulp, and brain matter, and on the floor of the living room lay the bodies of Christine Taylor and the family pet dog, almost unrecognizable. The blood that had covered Michael Taylor was Christine's blood. At about 9:30 that morning, in the Taylor family home, Michael had killed his wife Christine, the woman that he loved and the mother of his children. In a maniacal and deranged attack, Michael had stripped off and strangled Christine, and had literally torn off her face. There was no murder weapon involved. He had gouged out her eyes and ripped out her tongue with his bare hands, tearing the rest of her face down to the bone, so much so that she was left unrecognizable. Whilst Christine had died of shock and asphyxiation on her own blood fairly quickly, Michael had turned his attentions to the Taylor pet dog, strangling it and literally ripping it limb from limb. He had torn its legs from their sockets and hair and teeth and eyes from the skull. He then left the house screaming and was found by police a short time later. It was described as being the most horrific crime scene that any police officer who had attended it was ever to see. Michael was taken into police custody from the hospital, and when interviewed some hours later, when he was deemed rational to talk, he was asked to try to explain what had happened. He told Detective Inspector Brian Smith about the exorcism that had occurred only hours before, saying, "It was a long night. They danced around me and burned my cross because that was tainted with evil. They had me in the church all night. Look at my hands. I was banging on the floor. The power was in me. I couldn't get rid of it and neither could they. They were too late. I was compelled by a force within me to destroy everything living within the house." Although Michael claimed he could remember nothing of the actual murder, claiming to deeply love his wife, when asked by D.I. Smith how he felt, Michael replied, "Released. I am released. It is done. The evil in her has been destroyed." Although he appeared to have no motive for his actions, Michael Taylor was charged with the murder of Christine Taylor and was taken to Broadmoor Secure Hospital in Berkshire to await trial. While awaiting trial, Michael was reported to have spent most of the time in silence or sleeping. Perhaps some part of him never wanted to face what had happened, and how 5 children had in the space of a single day lost a mother and a father. Michael Taylor's trial for the murder of his wife Christine began in March 1975, and upon it commencing, the jury was advised by the barrister for the prosecution, Mr. Jeffrey Baker QC, that the evidence they were about to hear will make it difficult to believe that you are not back in the Middle Ages. Neither prosecution nor defense denied at the trial that Michael Taylor had severe mental issues. Michael himself testified, again claiming that he had no recollection of the actual killing, that he had deeply loved his wife and had been under the control of evil supernatural forces, and that he had suspected that Christine had also been possessed by demons. He offered no other explanation. At his trial in March, Michael Taylor was acquitted on the grounds of insanity. He was sent to Broadmoor Hospital for 2 years, then spent another 2 years in a secure ward in Bradford before being released. Michael had many suicide attempts, one where he threw himself from a bridge and suffered severe injuries to his back and to his legs. In another attempt, Michael cut his wrists. In July 2005, Michael re-entered the news when he was arrested for indecent conduct with a minor. During the trial for this incident, Michael Taylor pled guilty to 2 counts of sexual assault. Demonic forces once again started to take hold of Michael and he was again ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment, this time on an outpatient basis. He received no additional jail time. Michael has not re-emerged in the news since this incident and his current whereabouts are not known, though it is quite possible that he still resides in Ossett, West Yorkshire. Number 3. On the night of February 29, 2000, in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia, Katherine Knight murdered her boyfriend John Price. She took one of her recently sharpened knives and stabbed it into her sleeping partner. John Price jumped up from the bed, turned the light on and attempted to run out of the house. However, Kathy overpowered him and stabbed him more than 37 times. After he was dead, she then skinned him and hung the skin from a hook in the living room. Then, she decapitated him and cooked his head in a pot with some vegetables. She cooked the rest of him and planned on serving up the meat with baked potato, pumpkin, beetroot, zucchini, cabbage, yellow squash and gravy to John's kids. She had the table all set up, along with notes beside each plate, each having the name of one of John Price's children on it. She was preparing to serve his body parts to his children. A third meal was thrown on the back lawn for unknown reasons, and it is speculated that Katherine had attempted to eat it but could not. This has been put forward in support of her claim that she has no memory of the crime. Price's head was found in a pot with vegetables. Sometime later, Katherine arranged the body with the left arm draped over an empty soft drink bottle with his legs crossed. This was claimed in court to be an act of defilement demonstrating Katherine's contempt for John Price. Additionally, she had left a handwritten note on top of a photograph of John. Blood-stained and covered with small pieces of flesh, it read, "Time got you back, Jonathan, for raping my daughter. You to back, for Rose, for little John. Now play with little John's dick, John Price." It is believed she was writing about John's kids, Rebecca, Rosemary and little John. However, the note made very little sense. The accusations in the note were found to be untrue. At 6 a.m. the next day, the neighbor became concerned that John Price's car was still in the driveway, and when he did not arrive at work, his employer sent a worker to see what was wrong. Both the neighbor and the worker tried knocking on Price's bedroom window to wake him, However, they alerted police after noticing blood on the front door. Police arrived at 8 a.m. Breaking down the back door, police found Price's body, with Katherine Knight comatose from taking a large number of pills. Katherine was arrested and her initial offer to plead guilty to manslaughter was rejected. She was arraigned on March 2, 2001 on the charge of murdering John Price, to which she entered a plea of not guilty. Her trial was initially set for July 23, 2001, but it was adjourned due to her counsel's illness, and it was reset for October 15, 2001. When the trial commenced, Justice Barry O'Keefe offered the 60 jury prospects the option of being excused due to the nature of the photographic evidence, which 5 accepted. When the witness list was read out to the prospects, several more also dropped out, after which the jury was empaneled. Katherine's attorneys then spoke to the judge, who adjourned to the following day. The next morning, Katherine changed her plea to guilty and the jury was dismissed. It was then made public that Justice O'Keefe had been advised of the plea change the day before. He had adjourned the trial and then ordered a psychiatric assessment overnight to determine if Katherine understood the consequences of a guilty plea and was fit to make such a plea. Katherine's legal team had planned to defend Katherine by claiming amnesia and dissociation, a claim supported by most psychiatrists, although they did consider her sane. 2 psychiatrists concluded that she suffered from borderline personality disorder. No reason has ever been given for the guilty plea, and despite giving it, she still refused to accept responsibility for her actions. At the sentencing hearing, Katherine's lawyers requested that she be excused to avoid hearing some of the facts, but the application was refused. When Timothy Lyons took the stand and described the skinning and decapitation, Knight became hysterical and had to be sedated. On November 8, Justice O'Keefe pointed out that the nature of the crime and Katherine's lack of remorse required a severe penalty. He sentenced her to life imprisonment, refused to fix an on-parole period, and ordered that her papers be marked never to be released, the first time that this had been imposed on a woman in Australian history. In June 2006, Katherine appealed a life sentence, claiming that a penalty of life in prison without possibility of parole was too severe for the killing justices Peter McClellan, Michael Adams, and Megan Latham dismissed the appeal in the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal in September, with Justice McClellan writing in his judgment, "This was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society." Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.